Hello and welcome back to the Espresso Insiders podcast. Today we're going to discuss the different coffee brewing methods available to home baristas, how they work and some of the pros and cons of each of them. Now, you might not realise that you can make a great tasting cup of coffee using a variety of different brewing methods. But before we delve into that, let's just discuss what coffee brewing actually means. Coffee brewing can be boiled down to simply extracting flavoured oils from ground coffee beans using hot water, well, in most cases anyway. Regardless of the ratio, process or time taken, this is effectively what you're trying to do each time you make a cup of coffee. With this in mind, no matter whether you're using the humble French press or trying to master a brand new all-singing, all-dancing espresso machine, the goal is to extract the perfect amount of soluble coffee material out of the grounds and into your cup. Now, before we jump into the main coffee brewing methods you're likely going to come across as a home barista, let's just cover off some of the key variables that you're going to want to control when searching for the perfect brew. First off is the coffee to water ratio. In most cases, you're going to want to shoot for around about a 1:16 coffee to water ratio. This might sound quite specific, but this is universally accepted by the specialty coffee community as the go-to ratio. Without getting too technical, if you're aiming to fill a standard builder's mug of coffee, you'll need to produce around 500 mils or 17 ounces of coffee. Therefore, you're going to need around about 30 grams to 1 ounce of coffee and 470 millilitres to 16 fluid ounces of water. Whilst we're on the topic of water, I'd recommend switching out your standard tap water for filtered water if you can. This will help you keep everything tasting fresh. The main notable exception to this rule, however, is of course espresso, where you're going to want to aim for a 1:2 coffee to water ratio in most cases, but this is usually then diluted down by hot water or milk. Another thing you're going to want to keep in mind is the way you pour your water. This is important because it helps you maintain a consistent and even extraction of the coffee oils from the ground beans. I'd recommend pouring slowly in a circular motion so you're wetting as many of the coffee grounds as evenly as possible, regardless of whether you're using a French press, a V60 or even a drip machine. The final point you're going to want to pay close attention to is the grind size. It definitely requires some trial and error, but grind size is arguably the most sensitive variable when it comes to the overall taste of your coffee. I'll give you a recommendation of each grind size for all of the brewing methods as this episode progresses, but just remember to only make small changes if you're going to tweak things at all in the search of coffee perfection. Right then, the first coffee brewing method we're going to discuss is the home espresso machine. Now, of course, espresso can form many podcasts on its own, as it can become incredibly complicated very, very quickly. I like to think of espresso as a finely tuned instrument. Tiny adjustments can make a huge difference to the overall outcome. Home espresso machines are very, very different to commercial espresso machines that you'll find in your local coffee shop and will definitely yield different results. However, most home espresso machines still require a very fine grind size, almost like cocoa powder, to ensure you're extracting as much of those coffee solids out of your puck as you possibly can. One thing to bear in mind when it comes to home espresso, whilst this is of course called the Espresso Insiders podcast, I will warn you against trying to upgrade straight from instant coffee to a home espresso machine, just because you want to get a better tasting cup of coffee in the morning. There are many easier, quicker and more cost-effective ways to get a better tasting cup than just trying to master home espresso right off the bat. With that being said, if you're willing to put the time, effort and money into mastering espresso at home, the results can be incredibly rewarding. If you're going to make espresso, you'll want to aim for that golden 1:2 coffee to water ratio in around 25 to 30 seconds. Whilst you can technically use whichever coffee beans you like, I'd recommend using something relatively freshly roasted that's a dark to medium roast, especially if you're making a milk-based drink. Okay, the next brewing method I'm going to cover is the Moka Pot. This is a small metal pot that some people call the stovetop espresso machine. There are 3 separate compartments, which are the water chamber that sits at the bottom, then the coffee filter basket, which is shaped like a small cone with some filters in it and sits in the middle. And on top is the coffee collection chamber, which is a hold spout in the middle and it screws in place on top of the water chamber. Moka Pot coffee requires a relatively fine grind size, not quite as fine as espresso, but not as coarse as something you use for filter coffee, for example. This is because the water in the bottom of the chamber boils up and shoots through the coffee filter basket to produce thick, strong, bold tasting coffee. For context, the Moka Pot generally will produce around 1 bar of pressure, whereas an espresso machine, on the other hand, will usually operate at about 9 bar. Top tips for using a Moka Pot would be to make sure you screw the top section on very tightly and don't fill any more water above the pressure release valve on the bottom section, or you could end up with a coffee explosion. Also, make sure to keep an eye on your Moka Pot throughout the brew and leave the lid open so you know exactly what's going on throughout the brewing process. Nothing will happen for a few minutes and then the coffee will start coming up through the spout very quickly, so you'll need your wits about you during the whole process. Again, I'd recommend using a dark to medium roasted coffee bean to make the most of that bold, earthy texture that the Moka Pot tends to produce. Next up, it's the Aeropress. This is a relatively new invention and can make great tasting coffee on the go very quickly. It's a combination of a pressure-based system that also uses filter papers, so you can get a smooth coffee texture whilst maintaining that intense coffee flavour. The Aeropress can look a bit intimidating at first, but it's actually quite easy to use, especially if you're taking things slow to start off with. The key is to get your ratios right, screw the filter in very tightly, and make sure to press the plunger down with a gradual, even pressure to make sure you get the perfect extraction. In terms of grind size, the Aeropress is quite versatile actually, and can be used to make espresso-like coffee or a more traditional filter style. I'd recommend going for slightly coarser than what you'd use for a Moka Pot and make small adjustments from there. Something like table salt should be a good starting point. You should let your coffee ground steep for around 2 minutes before plunging down, and again, depending on how you're serving your Aeropress coffee, you can use anything from dark roasted, more savoury tasting beans, all the way up to lightly roasted, fruity or floral tasting coffee. Okay, the next brewing method we're going to discuss is the V60. This is a classic coffee brewing method that requires filter papers and a little bit more skill to get right. V60s sit on top of your cup and are often known as pour overs, as you literally pour water over the coffee grounds and the coffee drips down into your cup. In terms of grind size, the V60 sits pretty much perfectly in the middle of the spectrum of grind size and requires what most people would call a medium grind. Now, I know this isn't the most helpful description, so aim for something that resembles fine sand. The V60 requires a bit more precision, as the way you pour the water can play a huge role in how evenly the coffee is extracted. I'd recommend pouring from the middle and gradually working your way outwards, moving in concentric circles. Wait until the coffee bed is dried up and then repeat the process until your cup is full of hopefully delicious filter coffee. It should take around 3 minutes to make your V60 coffee from start to finish, and I'd recommend using a medium roast if you're pairing with milk, or a lighter roast if you're having it black. Next up is the Chemex, which is quite similar to the V60 but is larger and requires a slightly coarser grind size, as it's a larger piece of brewing equipment altogether. Chemexes are recognisable by their hourglass shape and often have a brown cork or leather grip in the middle. Chemexes come with larger filter papers and require even more precision to get right than V60s. But the result can be hugely rewarding, as Chemex coffee is often more delicate and light tasting than other brewing methods, which is why some people refer to it as wine-like. Chemexes take around 5 minutes to brew and are often best paired with lighter roasted coffee beans to bring out the intricacies of their flavour. The next brewing method we're going to cover is the French press. Most people have a French press knocking around at the bottom of their kitchen cupboard somewhere, but it can produce some of the best tasting coffee you could actually make. The French press is a very forgiving way to make coffee, especially if it's for a group of people. Simply add your coarsely ground coffee to your carafe, pour over your water and give it a gentle stir, and then leave it alone. You want to grind your coffee for French press similar to peppercorns or flaky kosher salt, by the way. I'd recommend leaving your coffee grounds to steep in your French press for around 10 minutes to ensure that you get as much of those robust flavours out of the beans as you possibly can. In terms of the beans themselves, personally, I like shooting for a darker roasted bean with a nice, rich, smoky or chocolatey flavour. This is really emphasised by the full-bodied mouthfeel that you get from the French press. Okay, so that rounds up this quick episode on the most popular coffee brewing methods you'll likely come across as a home barista. I hope you've enjoyed the episode and learned something new, and of course, there are some other notable mentions like the Kalita, the Clever Dripper, percolators, drip coffee machines and so on, but of course I'll cover those in another episode. Make sure to like and subscribe and let me know if there's any topics you want me to cover and hear about next. I'll see you on the next one.